Hello, Rams, and welcome to another episode of Rams History. Today is all about the Glorious Revolution. Now, I often find it's easy to remember the Stuart dynasty by thinking of them as a hamburger. James would be the top bun, Charles would be right below him. I like to think he was sliced like a pickle, get it? In the middle, you've got Oliver Cromwell, who was certainly not a Stuart, but rather a Puritan general who ran England as a dictatorship for a few years. And then, of course, right below Oliver Cromwell is the Restoration, when Charles II resumes the throne. And then below him, his brother James II, who took over after the death of Charles. Now, of course, to finish up this refreshing and tasty burger is a nice slice of William of Orange. See what I did there? Actually, William and his wife Mary took the throne. Mary was actually the daughter of James II, and she would take his place when he left England at the end of the Glorious Revolution. All right, now, when you last recall, Oliver Cromwell had ruled England for a number of years, and those years were rather dull for the people of England. Cromwell had banned dancing, he had banned the theater, public drunkenness, makeup, all those things that make life worth living had been prohibited by Cromwell. So when Cromwell died, his son very briefly took power, but proved completely unfit. And so in 1660, after some negotiations with Parliament, Charles II returned to England and resumed the throne as the next Stuart king. Now, for the people of England, this was actually a very exciting event. Remember, England had traditionally been a monarchy, and although there had been some issues there with Charles I, the people of England were happy to have their king back. And in fact, Charles II was something of a breath of fresh air. He had been in France for a time. When he came back, all of those things like dancing and the theater and fun were brought back. So the English people at first welcomed Charles upon his return, and the Restoration was greeted with celebrations all across Britain. Now, unbeknownst to everyone, though, Charles had a bit of a secret. And that secret was that he had Catholic sympathies. And in fact, he at first kept these sympathies under wraps because he knew that they would not be popular. But eventually, those Catholic sympathies would come seeping out for all to see, and they would cause him some trouble during his time as king. Now, Charles did sign a treaty with Louis XIV of France, and that treaty was known as the Treaty of Dover. Now, essentially, the treaty was meant to unite England and France in a war against the Dutch, against the Netherlands. But the treaty also had another component which was not so well known. In a secret part of the Treaty of Dover, Charles actually agreed to announce his conversion to Catholicism. So effectively, Charles II would announce that he was becoming a Catholic and thus give England a Catholic king. Now, this announcement was meant to be in return for financial support from Louis XIV. And of course, here we have the Sun King saying, "Make it rain, baby." Now, as it turns out, Charles never actually did make this announcement. It never did occur, although he did receive financial support for Louis and some half-hearted support in the war against the Dutch. Now, what Charles did do, however, was pass what was called the Declaration of Indulgence, and this was a law that essentially suspended any prohibitions against Catholics and non-Anglican Protestants. Effectively, what Charles did here was he allowed religious toleration in Great Britain. So essentially, the Declaration of Indulgence was perceived by many in England as a sign of the king's Catholic sympathies. Now, in response to the Declaration of Indulgence, Parliament passed a law they call the Test Act. And the purpose of the Test Act was to effectively bar Catholics from any type of civil or military service. Basically, anyone assuming one of these posts had to take an oath which denied the doctrine of transubstantiation, this concept that the bread and wine in the Eucharist become the body and blood of Christ. Of course, no Catholic could actually take that oath, and so the purpose of the Test Act was to effectively bar Catholics from any type of civic participation. Now, religious troubles aside, I do have to mention a lighter side of Charles here. He was known as the Merry Monarch, and again, as I mentioned earlier, when he initially arrived in England, he was seen by many as sort of this exciting new figure. I will say this about Charles, though. He did love the ladies. He had a bit of a weakness there for the female gender. And in fact, when he died in 1685, he actually died without a legitimate heir. However, he did acknowledge at least 14 illegitimate children by numerous mistresses. So Charles was certainly a busy guy in his off hours. Now, what I do admire about Charles, and I do find this fact to be pretty admirable, is that he acknowledged all of his children and he did provide financial support for them. So he did make an effort, at least, to support these children and their mothers, and I do find that admirable in him. Now, just before his death, Charles finally made that long-awaited announcement where he was converting to Catholicism. So on his deathbed in 1685, Charles II finally converted to Catholicism. So I guess Louis XIV finally got what he wanted, although I think a bit later than he was hoping for. Now, because Charles had died without a legitimate heir, his brother James becomes the next Stuart king. And this really opens up a huge amount of controversy because Charles II had Catholic sympathies, although he didn't act on them until very late in life. James, however, was openly Catholic. He was a Catholic. He made no secret of his Catholic faith. And in fact, his second wife was also a Catholic as well. So now the question, of course, remains, can a Catholic king effectively rule a Protestant country? England's last experience with a Catholic queen was certainly not a happy one. So James automatically assumes the throne under a cloud of turmoil. In fact, it was the succession of James to the throne which in some ways helped to get the first political parties organized in Britain, the Tories and the Whigs. Now, there were other reasons why these parties formed as well, but effectively the Tories were the ones who sort of favored the concept of absolute monarchy. Tories favored the succession of James to the English throne, whereas the Whigs, on the other hand, wanted to exclude James. They felt that as a Catholic, he was not a legitimate king and therefore should not take the throne. And this was actually what they called the exclusion crisis. There was actually a lot of upset in Parliament over the succession of James to the throne. In addition, there was also a military conflict. The Duke of Monmouth led a rebellion against James II. He was actually an illegitimate son of Charles II and claimed he was the legitimate heir to the throne. So Monmouth actually led a very brief rebellion against James, although it doesn't last very long. His army is very poorly prepared with very little military experience, and his forces are very quickly crushed at a battle called the Battle of Sedgemoor. So Monmouth is executed as a traitor along with hundreds of his followers. Now, this event was known as the Bloody Assizes, and during the trials that followed the Monmouth Rebellion, somewhere around 300 rebels were executed. Most were hanged, but others were hanged, drawn, and quartered. Some were beheaded, and others were burned alive. A larger number, somewhere around 800, were actually packed off to the West Indies, where they were used as a cheap labor force. And of course, many of them actually wound up dying from disease and other things in the Indies. Now, again, James is openly Catholic, so one of the first things he does as king is he dissolves the Test Act. He essentially takes a law passed by Parliament and basically nullifies it. Then he passes what's called the Declaration of Indulgence, and this effectively allows Catholics the freedom to worship as they wish. So James is making it very clear that he intends not only to act as a divine right king, but also that he is going to clearly have a policy favoring Catholics. Now, in addition to this, he actually has 7 Anglican bishops arrested. The bishops were ordered to publicize the Declaration of Indulgence. Now, remember, back in the 1600s, one of the best ways to quickly get news out was to have it read in the churches. And 7 Anglican bishops actually refused to do that. They would not read this Declaration of Indulgence. And so they were arrested by James and put on trial. Now, later on trial, they were found not guilty, which was a pretty big embarrassment to the king. But the fact that he would actually arrest Anglican bishops and sort of infringe upon the independence of the Anglican Church was seen as a shocking thing by many people in England and convinced Parliament that it was time for James to go. Now, I think if Parliament had a choice here, they simply would have tried to hold out and wait for James to die naturally. The thinking was that his daughter Mary would become the next Queen of England, and she was a Protestant, so the belief was that all we have to do is kind of wait for James to go, and then he'll have a Protestant daughter take over and problem solved. However, James had a second wife who was also Catholic, and she gave birth to a healthy baby boy. And then it became clear to Parliament that what this meant was yet another Catholic king taking the throne of England. So Parliament decides it's time to act. And what follows next is known as the Glorious Revolution. Parliament invites William of Orange, who was a stadtholder in the Dutch Republic, to become king. And of course, he can do this through his marriage to Mary, who is herself a Stuart. So William and Mary actually invade England at the invitation of Parliament. William does bring along an army, but as it turns out, it's not needed. The British Army and Navy actually go over and join William, and James II takes a boat to France about as quickly as he can. Now, it's important to remember that the Glorious Revolution was not entirely bloodless. It was almost bloodless. However, there were some rebellions in Ireland and Scotland over this that did result in some pretty significant loss of life in those areas. So the Glorious Revolution was perhaps not as glorious as it's often been portrayed. Now, before becoming king, Parliament had William sign what's called the English Bill of Rights. This is a very important document in English history. It's right up there with the Magna Carta and the Petition of Right. Now, this document actually sets limits upon the power of the king, and it clearly establishes Parliament as a co-leader of England. So essentially, this finally enshrines the concept of limited monarchy in English history. So England never will have an absolute monarch because of this. Now, about a century later, when the United States Constitution was being written, many of the principles laid forth in the English Bill of Rights would later set to serve as an example for the United States Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments. As far as the religious issue goes, William passes the Toleration Act of 1689. Now, this extends religious toleration to all Protestants, not just Anglicans, but to any Protestant faith. However, Catholics remain exempted. Religious toleration is not extended to them. And also, a law is passed which prohibits Catholics from ever again taking the throne of England. After England's experience with a Catholic king, it was an unhappy experience. The English were determined that there would never again be another Catholic king. So, ladies and gentlemen, England's taken quite a journey here through the years in the Stuart dynasty, and As the 1700s began, England has finally achieved a measure of political stability, and England will remain a limited parliamentary monarchy, which it remains to this day. So thank you for watching Rams History. I did hope you enjoy your time spent with us, and as always, if you enjoy what you see here, please like and subscribe. We'll see you again soon. Bye-bye.